Story 1. The mirror in the hallway. When I moved into this apartment, I thought the biggest problem would be the creaky floors or the noisy upstairs neighbors. I didn't think it would be the mirror. It came with the place, a long, full-length antique thing bolted to the hallway wall. The landlord said it was a fixture like the lights or the stove. I didn't give it much thought at first. It wasn't my style, too ornate, with a dark, wooden frame carved into twisting floral patterns that looked more like tangled veins than roses. But it wasn't worth the effort to ask if I could remove it. The first time I noticed something strange was during my second week here. I'd been hanging up a coat in the hallway when I glanced at the mirror and saw my reflection looking back. Only, it lingered for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. I laughed it off. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe whatever. But it kept happening. Sometimes I'd catch myself walking past it, and my reflection wouldn't quite match up with my movements. I'd lift my hand, and for the briefest instant, the image would lag behind before jerking into place. Other times, when I'd pass by quickly, I'd catch something in the background, a flicker of movement, a shadow darting across the glass. When I turned to look, the hallway behind me was empty. I told myself it was nothing, light playing tricks, a trick of my brain, until the night I woke up to whispers. It was soft at first, faint murmurs, too quiet to make out, like someone having a muffled conversation right outside my bedroom door. I sat up in bed, the hair on my arms standing on end. I checked my phone, 2:43 a.m. That's when I noticed the door. It was open. I never sleep with my bedroom door open. I'm a light sleeper, and even the faintest sliver of light from the hallway keeps me awake. I was sure I'd closed it before bed. I crept out of bed, heart pounding. The whispers grew louder the closer I got to the door. They weren't coming from another apartment. They were coming from the hallway. I stepped into the hall and froze. The mirror. There was someone in the mirror. It was me, my reflection, but it wasn't doing what I was doing. It wasn't standing there frozen in place like I was. Instead, it was smiling. Wide. Too wide. Its lips stretched into a grin that didn't look natural, the corners of its mouth curling unnaturally high. And then it moved. It lifted its hand, not to mimic me, but to wave. Slowly, I bolted back into my room, slammed the door shut, and spent the rest of the night huddled in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin. By the time morning rolled around, I was convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. I'd been half asleep. I was stressed. I was overworked. Any excuse to avoid the thought that something might actually be wrong. But then the messages started. The next night, as I brushed my teeth, I noticed something scrawled across the mirror's surface, written in condensation that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. 3 words. Let me in. I stared at it, toothbrush frozen in my hand. It wasn't possible. The hallway wasn't humid. There wasn't any steam. It wasn't even cold enough to fog up the glass. And I sure as hell hadn't written it. I wiped it clean with my sleeve, trying to keep my hands from shaking. That night, I dreamed about the mirror. I dreamed I was standing in front of it, staring at my reflection, and it wasn't smiling this time. It was screaming. The next morning, I decided to ask my neighbor, Mrs. Talbot, if she knew anything about the mirror. She was in her 70s, sharp as a tack, and had lived in the building for decades. If anyone knew its history, it would be her. When I brought it up, she gave me a strange look. That mirror, she said, lowering her voice. It belonged to the last tenant. She left it behind when she moved out. Why? I asked. She didn't move out, Mrs. Talbot said. She ran. Middle of the night. Left everything behind. I remember because I heard her screaming that night. Never saw her again. That was the last thing I wanted to hear. By that point, I was avoiding the mirror altogether. I took a wide step around it whenever I had to pass through the hallway, and I covered it with a sheet at night. But even with the sheet up, I could feel it, watching. One night, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed the sound. A faint tapping like fingernails clicking against glass. It was coming from the hallway. I stood up slowly, heart thudding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The sheet was moving. Something was pressing against it from the other side. I don't know what possessed me to pull the sheet down, but I did. My reflection stood there, staring at me. It wasn't smiling anymore. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and its mouth hung open like it was mid-scream. But there was no sound, just silence. And then it moved. It pressed its hand against the glass, and I swear I saw the surface ripple like water. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and watched in horror as it started to push through. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy lamp, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards raining down onto the hardwood floor. For a brief moment, the reflection twisted, contorting into something unrecognizable, and then it was gone. I stood there, panting, surrounded by broken glass. Relief washed over me. It was over, or so I thought. As I turned to leave, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The shards of glass on the floor, they were still reflecting my image. Only, my reflection wasn't lying broken like the pieces of the mirror. It was standing, and it was stepping toward me. Before I could react, the largest shard of glass rippled like liquid, and my hand, reached out and grabbed my ankle. I screamed, but it was already pulling me down, into the shards, into the mirror, into whatever was on the other side. Now, as I write this, I can see you reading. I can see you staring at this screen. Do me a favor. When you finish, don't look at your reflection. It's already looking at you. Story 2. The Static on Channel 3. I don't even watch TV anymore, but that night, I woke up to the sound of static. And it wasn't just on the TV, it was everywhere. I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours when the noise woke me. It was sharp and grating, that familiar hiss and crackle of white noise, but louder and more insistent, as if it wasn't coming from the TV in the corner of my living room, but from the walls, the floor, the air itself. I groggily got out of bed, rubbing my eyes, and stumbled into the living room. Sure enough, my old boxy TV, an ancient relic I hadn't touched in years, was on, the screen glowing faintly blue-gray with static. Weird. I was sure I'd unplugged it ages ago. I grabbed the remote off the coffee table, hit the power button, and the screen went black. The static hiss stopped immediately, leaving the apartment in eerie silence. For a moment, I stood there in the darkened room, feeling vaguely uneasy. Then I heard the click. The TV flickered back on, its screen once again flooded with static. The noise was even louder this time, a grating roar that made my teeth ache. What the hell? I muttered under my breath. I walked over to the TV, crouched down, and yanked the power cord out of the wall. The screen went dark again, and the static cut out mid-hiss. Satisfied, I straightened up and turned to go back to bed. But then I froze. From behind the walls, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking. It was slow at first, deliberate, like someone was tapping their knuckles in time with the clocks ticking. Knock, knock, knock. Then it sped up, growing faster and more frantic until it sounded like fists pounding on the drywall. I backed away, staring at the wall. My heart pounded in my chest as the knocking reached a fever pitch and then suddenly stopped. The silence was worse. I turned around, intending to head back to my room, when I noticed something on the TV. Even though it was unplugged, the screen was glowing again. Static flickered across its surface, but this time, it wasn't just random noise. There was something in the static. Shadows. Shapes. Moving. I stepped closer, squinting at the screen. The shadows swirled and shifted, forming dark, indistinct shapes that flickered in and out of focus. At first, I thought they might be faces, but when I leaned in closer, I realized they were too distorted to be human. Their features were warped, stretched in strange and impossible ways, their mouths hanging open as if screaming. But no sound came from the TV, just the static. My skin prickled. I backed away from the TV and grabbed my phone, planning to call anyone. But as soon as I unlocked it, the static started playing through the phone speaker. The same hissing roar so loud it hurt my ears. I dropped the phone in shock, and when it hit the floor, the noise stopped. That's when I noticed my computer screen glowing. I hadn't turned it on in weeks, but there it was, the monitor flickering with the same gray static. The shadows were there, too, moving faster now, their distorted mouths gaping wide. I turned to look at my radio on the shelf. It had clicked on by itself, broadcasting nothing but static. It was everywhere. I unplugged everything. The computer, the radio, even the lamp, just in case. But the static didn't stop. The TV was still glowing, still buzzing with that terrible noise. The shadows on the screen now writhing in a frenzy. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy glass paperweight, and hurled it at the TV. The screen shattered with a deafening crash, shards of glass scattering across the floor. For a moment, the static cut out, and I stood there, panting, feeling a flicker of relief. Then I heard it. Someone whispered my name. It came from right behind me. I spun around, but the living room was empty. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. And then I saw it. Every reflective surface in the room. The shards of broken glass, the dark screen of my computer, the black mirror of my phone, was showing my face. But it wasn't my face. It was distorted, warped, like the shadows I'd seen in the static. My eyes were sunken and hollow, my mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that seemed to split my face in half. And it was staring directly at me. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the coffee table, and scrambled to my feet. Everywhere I turned, I saw it, on the shards of the TV, on my phone, on the screen of the microwave in the kitchen. That awful, twisted version of me, watching, grinning, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with all the lights on, too scared to move, too scared to even blink. At some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. Everything was quiet. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I looked around, I realized something was wrong. All of my electronics were gone. The TV, the computer, the radio, my phone. Everything had vanished. The only thing left was the shattered husk of the TV, its screen now cracked but faintly glowing. And then I saw what was on the screen. It was me, a live feed of me, sitting on the couch, staring at the TV. But the perspective was all wrong. It was being filmed from somewhere above me, like a security camera mounted on the ceiling. Only there was nothing there. No camera. No way the image could exist. As I watched, the me on the screen turned its head and looked directly into the lens. And then it smiled. Story 3. The neighbors upstairs. I've lived in this apartment for 2 years, and I've never met the people upstairs. But I sure as hell can hear them every night. It usually starts around midnight. Loud footsteps, pacing back and forth across the ceiling, accompanied by the occasional thud like something heavy being dropped. Sometimes it's the sound of furniture scraping, long, drawn-out drags that make my teeth ache. And once I swear I heard muffled crying. It's irritating, sure, but for the most part, I've managed to ignore it. That is, until last week when the sounds got worse. Now it's constant. The pacing lasts for hours, and it's heavier, angrier, like whoever's up there is stomping from one side of the apartment to the other. The dragging sounds have turned into loud crashes, as if they're slamming furniture against the walls. And the crying is louder too. Desperate. I've pounded on the ceiling with a broom more times than I can count. They don't stop. They don't even slow down. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cornered my landlord, Mr. Evans, in the hallway one morning. He's an older guy, slow-moving, with thick glasses and a permanent frown. "The people upstairs," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "They're driving me crazy. They're up all night making noise. Can you talk to them or something?" He gave me a strange look, adjusting his glasses. "There's no one upstairs." I blinked. "What do you mean? I hear them every night. There's someone up there." He shook his head. "That unit's been empty for months. The last tenants moved out in the spring." I stared at him, dumbfounded. He seemed completely serious. "Are you sure? Maybe someone's squatting." "I would know if there were squatters," he said, his voice firm. "The apartment's empty." I didn't argue with him. What was the point? But as I walked back to my place, unease settled over me. If the apartment was really empty, then what the hell was I hearing every night? That night, the noise started again. Heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth. Then the dragging. Then the crying. Louder than ever. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. Finally, at 2:15 a.m., I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and slipped out of my apartment, heading for the stairwell. The hallway upstairs was dimly lit, the air thick and stale, like no one had been there in months. I found the door to the upstairs apartment. It was slightly ajar. My heart was pounding as I pushed it open. Inside, the apartment was dark, but I could just make out the layout thanks to the faint light spilling in from the hallway. It was completely empty. No furniture, no signs of life. Nothing, except for the chair. In the center of the living room sat a single wooden chair. It looked old, the kind you'd find at a thrift store, with a cracked seat and peeling paint. Something about it made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam sweeping the room. The floors were covered in scratches, long, deep gouges that crisscrossed the wood like something heavy had been dragged across it over and over again. That's when I heard it, the dragging sound. But it wasn't coming from the floor above me. It was coming from above my head. I froze, tilting my flashlight upward. The ceiling was covered in scratch marks, just like the floor. And as I stared, I realized the dragging sound wasn't coming from the apartment upstairs at all. It was coming from the walls. I felt sick. Something slammed the door shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The door was closed, and no amount of pulling on the handle would budge it. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" No response. Just silence. Then the lights started flickering. At first, it was just a few slow, rhythmic flashes. Then they started strobing wildly, casting the room in brief bursts of light and shadow. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally stretched, as though it had been pulled too hard in all directions. Its face was obscured in the shadows, but I could see its arms, long and spindly, dragging along the floor. It stepped forward and I instinctively backed away, right into the chair. The second I touched it, my legs gave out beneath me. It was like I'd been shoved into the seat, my body frozen in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The figure moved closer, its head tilting at an unnatural angle as it studied me. Then it leaned down, bringing its face inches from mine. Its eyes, they weren't human. They were black and reflective, like two pools of ink, and I could see myself in them. My own terrified face staring back at me. It smiled, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. Then it whispered, its voice rasping like dry leaves. "It's your turn now." The lights went out completely. I don't know how long I was in that chair. When I finally woke up, it was morning, and I was back in my own apartment. At first, I thought it had been a nightmare. But then I heard it. The pacing, the dragging, the crying. Only this time, it wasn't coming from above me. It was coming from below. Story 4. The night I watched myself sleep. It started with a glitch in my phone's camera. Just a bug, I told myself. But I wasn't prepared for what it showed me. I've been using my phone as a makeshift baby monitor for the past few months. Nothing fancy, just propped up on a stack of books on the dresser in my daughter Lily's nursery, pointed at her crib. It gave me peace of mind to check the live feed every so often while I lay in bed. Parenting is exhausting, and when you're constantly running on 2 hours of sleep, you'll do whatever works. Last week, though, I made a mistake. I'd been so tired that I must have forgotten to angle the phone toward the crib after setting it up. When I woke up the next morning and went to check the footage, I like to scrub through it just to make sure Lily didn't fuss too much in the night. I realized the camera had been pointed at my bed instead. The image of myself lying there, tangled in the sheets, half asleep and drooling, was embarrassing enough. But as I fast-forwarded through the video, something else caught my eye. At around 2:43 a.m., my body sat upright. It wasn't a gradual movement. I didn't roll over or stretch. I just sat straight up, as if someone had pulled a string tie to my back. My head tilted slightly, and I stared directly at the camera. My stomach churned. It had to be a glitch. I must have been dreaming, sleepwalking maybe. People do weird things when they're overtired. I kept watching, waiting for myself to lie back down. But I didn't. For the next 2 hours, I sat there, completely still. I stared at the camera without blinking. The recording ended when the sun rose, the light flooding my bedroom and washing out the image on the screen. That's when my body finally moved again, lying back down like nothing had happened. I closed the video, my fingers trembling. It didn't make sense. I would have remembered sitting up like that. I would have remembered staring. It's just exhaustion, I whispered to myself. You're overtired, and you're making it a bigger deal than it is. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The next night, I set up the phone again. This time, I made sure it was pointing at the crib. I triple-checked it, but instead of going to sleep, I stayed awake, curled up under my blanket with the live feed open on my phone. I told myself it was just to make sure Lily didn't wake up, but deep down, I wanted to see if it happened again. The hours ticked by, and eventually, exhaustion got the better of me. My eyes drooped, and I fought to stay awake, but I must have dozed off at some point. When I woke up, the phone was still clutched in my hand, and the screen had gone dark. I checked the recording as soon as I opened my eyes. Once again, the phone was pointed at me. I had definitely angled it toward the crib before going to bed. I know I did, but somehow, the camera had shifted to face my bed, just like the night before. And there I was. At first, it was normal, just me tossing and turning, trying to get comfortable. But then, at 3:07 a.m., my body sat up. This time, I wasn't alone. There was something standing in the corner of the room. It was hard to make out, shrouded in darkness, but the faint glow from the phone screen illuminated its outline. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body thin and angular. It didn't move. It just stood there watching, and so did I. On the screen, my body tilted its head in the same direction as the figure, like I was acknowledging it. Then I turned to face the camera, my head jerking unnaturally fast. I didn't just stare this time. I smiled. Not a normal smile. It was too wide. The corners of my mouth stretched unnaturally high, as if someone had carved it into my face. My eyes looked wrong, too. Darker than usual, almost black, and glistening in the faint light. I shut off the recording, my chest heaving as panic set in. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't exhaustion. Something was wrong. I didn't bother setting up the phone that night. I told myself I didn't want to risk another recording error. But the truth was, I was terrified. I couldn't handle seeing whatever had been standing in the corner of my room, or worse, watching myself smile like that again. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house, every soft shuffle from Lily's nursery set my nerves on edge. I felt like I wasn't alone, even though I was. At least I thought I was. The next night, I couldn't resist. Curiosity got the better of me, or maybe it was paranoia. I had to know. I set up the camera again, and I stayed awake, this time determined not to fall asleep. I held the phone in my trembling hands, watching the live feed in real time. For hours, nothing happened. I started to think it had been my imagination, that I'd let my exhaustion play tricks on me. But then, at 3:33 a.m., my body moved. On the screen, I sat up slowly, as if I knew I was being watched. My head turned sharply, and my eyes locked on the camera. And then I smiled. I bit back a scream as I watched my body on the screen raise its hand and wave. Slowly, mockingly, I dropped the phone, the live feed still playing. My whole body was shaking. I looked down at my hands, clutching the blanket in terror. And that's when I realized something was wrong. They were translucent. I could see the faint outline of the blanket through my fingers. It was like I wasn't entirely solid, like I was fading into nothing. I glanced back at the phone on the bed. The me on the screen wasn't fading. It was solid, whole, and it was standing up. I froze as it moved closer to the camera, tilting its head to the side. It reached out toward the lens, and for a split second, I thought it was going to crawl through the screen. Instead, it whispered something. At first, I couldn't make it out, but then the words became clearer. "Are you watching?" I stared, paralyzed as the screen flickered, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. The phone was gone. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and looked around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. For a moment, I thought it had all been a bad dream. But then I glanced at the mirror across the room and saw the phone sitting on the dresser, propped up and pointed directly at me. And that's when I realized I wasn't watching the recording. I was the one being recorded. In the reflection, my body was still lying in bed, motionless, unblinking, smiling. Story 5. The door that wasn't there yesterday. There's only one door in my bedroom. Always has been. But last night, I woke up to find another one on the opposite wall. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It was a plain, wooden door, unpainted, with no handle or knob, just a keyhole in the center. The kind of door you'd see in a basement or an old closet. It didn't match the rest of my apartment at all. I rubbed my eyes and stared at it for a few seconds. It didn't move, didn't shimmer or disappear. It was just there. What the hell? I muttered, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. I stood up, every nerve in my body on edge, and slowly approached it. When I was close enough to touch it, I hesitated, my hand hovering just inches from the wood. I knocked, lightly at first. The sound echoed back hollowly, but there was no response. I pressed my ear against the door and listened. Silence. Shaking my head, I backed away. It's not real, I told myself. I'm overtired, and I'm seeing things. But when I woke up the next morning, it was still there. I called my landlord to ask if there had been any construction or renovations overnight, even though I knew how ridiculous I sounded. Predictably, he was just as confused as I was. A door? In your bedroom? He asked. Yes, I said, pacing back and forth. It wasn't there before. It just appeared. He chuckled nervously like he thought I was joking. Look, man, no one's been in your apartment. Maybe you just didn't notice it before. Didn't notice? I snapped. I've lived here for 3 years. I think I'd know if there was a random door in my bedroom. But no matter how much I tried to convince him, or myself, I couldn't get a straight answer. That night, the knocking started. It was faint at first, so soft I thought I imagined it. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced like someone tapping their knuckles on the wood. I froze in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. It came again, louder this time. I turned on the light, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the door looked the same as it had before. Silent. Inert. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, the door was closer. It had moved about a foot closer to my bed, inching across the wall like a spider. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. I pushed my dresser in front of it that night, blocking it as best I could. It didn't matter. At 2:15 a.m., the knocking woke me again. I bolted upright, staring at the dresser. It was shaking, faintly, the knocks reverberating through the wood. And then I heard it. Help me. It was a child's voice. Small, fragile, terrified. I broke out in a cold sweat. Who's there? I called out, my voice trembling. Please, the voice said, muffled but desperate. Please help me. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but I couldn't shake the sound of that voice. Against every instinct, I got out of bed and moved the dresser aside. The door stood there, waiting. I reached out, my hand trembling, and gripped the edge of the door. I wasn't even sure it could open. It didn't have a handle. But when I pulled, it swung inward with a long, low creak. Behind it was a staircase, spiraling downward into pitch darkness. Hello? I called, my voice shaking. Help me, the voice repeated, now coming from somewhere far below. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around, to close the door and never open it again. But I couldn't leave that voice behind. I stepped onto the staircase, and the door slammed shut behind me. The stairs seemed endless. They spiraled down and down, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the walls narrowed, pressing in on me like a vice. Where are you? I called out, my voice echoing. Please, the child's voice sobbed. Don't leave me. I picked up my pace, but no matter how far I descended, I never seemed to get any closer. My legs burned, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the bottom. It was my bedroom. I blinked, disoriented. I was back where I started, standing in the exact same room I'd left, but something was different. There were 2 doors now. The original one I'd woken up to, and another one, identical to the first, on the opposite wall. My stomach churned. The bed was still unmade, the dresser still pushed to the side, but something about the room felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. I turned to leave, but the moment I stepped toward the original door, the knocking started again. 3 sharp raps, this time coming from both doors. My chest tightened as I looked between them, unsure which one to open, or if I should open either. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like fists pounding against the wood. And then the voice came again. "Help me," it begged. But this time, it wasn't a child's voice. It was mine. I don't know how many times the cycle repeated. Every time I opened the door, I ended up back in my bedroom, and every time there were more doors. 3, 5, 10. The walls started changing too. The pictures hanging above my bed were no longer the ones I put there. Instead, they showed me twisted, bloody, grinning versions of myself. In one, my face was split down the middle, dark voids where my eyes should have been. In another, I was hanging from the ceiling, my head lolling at an impossible angle. The knocking never stopped. I tried locking the doors, blocking them with furniture, but it didn't matter. They always opened, always led me back to the same room. And then in the final loop, I did something different. I locked the door and didn't open it. For a moment, the knocking stopped. I let out a shaky breath, thinking it was finally over. But then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't coming from the other side of the door. It was coming from my side. I turned around slowly, and my heart dropped. The door was gone, and the knocking was coming from inside the walls.